Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight, we'll be talking about the United Nations Association. Not the United Nations, but the United Nations Association, and what its relationship is to the UN, and how you, as an average viewer, citizen, can get involved. Our guests tonight are Liana and Liana. Liana Akkawi, Liana Bran, and we're just going to call you A and B for tonight.
Sounds good to us.
Yeah. So you're both volunteers with the United Nations Association. So the first thing I want to ask, of course, is what is the United Nations Association and how is it different from the UN itself? So, Liana A?
Well, we come together and we kind of take the United Nations goals and focus in on each one and kind of volunteer to put together some educational opportunities to kind of support those goals for the United Nations. And here at the Chicago chapter, both Liana and I have been focusing in on the second goal, which is around sustainability, world hunger, and access to food and nutrition.
So who is it that you educate?
The community around Chicago, any associations nearby that are also have the same goals that we kind of partner up with and spread the word to however, wherever, and however many people we can get to.
So you communicate what the programs are within the United Nations itself,
yes,
and how those programs can be administered and how these local organizations might get involved and take advantage of those UN programs?
Yes.
So I think of the UN as something that does all sorts of things overseas. But in fact, you're here in Chicago and introducing Chicago groups. So can they take advantage locally?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the United Nations goals are international conflicts and global goals. And a lot of that just being in one place, for example, in Chicago, many are not aware of the international conflict, international struggles that go on, and that's what we're here to educate too, and even pertaining to any local conflicts and struggles as well. You can kind of tie in, it all ties in together.
So, Liana, coming up.
Yeah, I'll add to that because I've been with the organization for a couple years, and that's always the first question we get, and sometimes people think that we are with the UN, and as interesting as that would be for me, we are actually an initiative of the United Nations Foundation. So it was created, it's actually part of a larger network. There's chapters throughout the United States that's intended, as we kind of talked about, to bring the work of the UN to the chapters in the communities throughout the U.S. to kind of understand what does that look like for us, how do we engage with that, support the work of the United Nations, and then as Liana A. mentioned, really it's a lot about education and having people really relate to what is being done through the organization and have it be a little bit clearer to them.
So what does the UN offer to local organizations? You know, we recently had a show here with talking about homelessness in Chicago. So there's lots of issues that really resonate close to home. Are there UN programs that can be tapped into that might help with a local issue like homelessness or food deserts, things like that?
Yeah, so actually one of our newer initiatives is focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's something that...
So talk about Sustainable Development Goals for a moment. Not everyone knows what that is.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's take a step back. And so to give a little bit more color to that, around the turn of the century, 2000, the UN put out these Millennium Development Goals, and those were about 8 targets that were trying to really get at what are some of those big issues that we want to make an impact on.
Like reduce poverty worldwide,
poverty,
bring up
hunger,
wages, reduce infant mortality.
Absolutely.
Right.
So that was the focus of the Millennium Development Goals, and when those goals had more or less an expiration dates of 2015, that they were trying to make progress against those goals. And so once 2015 came around, they wanted to have this renewed vision and reevaluate what next, what do we do? And so this next round, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's 17 new goals that span some of the same issues, but have also really considered on a larger scale, what are some of the things that impact us? And actually, this was before my time at the UNA, but one of the programs actually the intention was to bring the input of citizens, in communities throughout the U.S., hear about what they think should be some of those goals, and bring back some of that information to the UN.
Well, let's talk for a minute about the original Millennium Goals from 2000. My understanding is that they were actually very successful, and that quite a bit of progress was made against that goal. Is that correct?
That's my general impression of it. And of course, these were really ambitious goals. So I think as we look at the UN, of course, tries to capture most of the world's population. And so when you look at it, you look at the outcomes across the board, but some countries, I understand, made more progress, or it looks a little bit different from them. So I think as a global population, we can always do more. So this is kind of the next iteration, and also expanding it and looking at some new targets as well.
So let's come back to some of those new targets. Liana?
Yeah.
Liana. Talking about food and nutrition, I know this is something you're focusing on.
Yeah.
So what is the new development goal within these new goals for nutrition, for hunger?
Yeah.
How is that defined by the UN?
Well, even, I mean, when we look back to the original goals as well, they were pretty ambitious, and even the new ones are pretty ambitious as well. For example, by 2030, we want to end world hunger, and we're in the year almost 2018.
Now, I just should point out that that's usually the butt of a joke, and when someone says, oh, we want to change such and such, I say, hey, why don't you just solve world hunger? But here it is, you're actually, the UN is actually going to try to do that, right? So how? I mean, how does any organization approach that?
Yeah, it's about food access and food, just bringing access to people who can't have it. So we see, and in the past, maybe around 1950s or a little bit earlier, you see that there was world hunger and malnutrition going on in Europe. But then we see most recently that it's been shifting to the sub-African countries and even India. And I think a lot of that is we need to tap into a lot of the urban or the rural areas where we can utilize all this space and land to kind of grow food, have more access to food for these people in these areas. And a lot of the people that we see that are suffering from this are the farmers who are providing the food for us. So it's funny because, for example, in India, most of the farmers have maybe 1 hectare of land that they provide food for, that they provide their own family income from. 1 hectare of land is about 2 acres. If you think about a football field, 1 acre is about 90% of a football field. So if you have any illnesses to the plants that could spread so rapidly, it could wipe out the entire crop, your income for the family, and sourcing. Like people don't think when you sit down for a meal where your food comes from, and I think more consumers nowadays are paying attention to this.
In fact, a colleague of mine took her grandson out to show him a farm because she didn't want him to think that Doritos came from the Dorito bush.
If only, right?
If only. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I would want to eat them off the bush. But in any case, one thing about hunger and farming, you mentioned small farms.
Yeah.
What I read about global warming is that this is a significant issue, and it's particularly in sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
Where the Sahara itself is expanding, and desertification of land is a real problem. And what has resulted is that it has spurred mass migrations, refugees essentially,
Yeah.
where the farmland no longer supports farming. And so these are part and parcel of world hunger, and in fact, some projections, world hunger may get worse because of the effects of climate change.
And an increase in population.
And the increased population, right. So we have an increasing population and decreasing farmland,
Yeah.
Particularly in the areas where it's most acutely needed.
Yeah.
So is that part of what the UN and your endeavors that you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. It's looking for outlets that we can tap into. And if that means educating more students or educating more kids at a younger age, and you see
Specifically about what?
Agriculture. We actually Liana and I just met with the Chicago Agricultural School in I believe one of the suburbs in Chicago, I believe around Beverly, and the model of the school is it's a normal high school with normal classes, but their electives are around urban agriculture, and with different routes, whether it's food science or whether it's farming or biotechnology, aqua farming or
aquaculture.
Aquaculture, yes, thank you. And it's fascinating because you don't see too much of that, but I hope and believe that more of those will start popping up. So it is about how do we utilize the knowledge and how do we utilize the space that we have.
So let's assume we do this and we educate people in this high school and maybe others. How do we translate that into actual addressing food shortages in Africa? Training kids in Chicago, how does that translate to overseas, Africa, South Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, again, the larger goal of the United Nations Association is to look at these issues that impact us all. Even, I think, for those of us who are fortunate, we don't feel that every day, having us understand what does hunger look like for Chicagoans, what does it look like for people across the United States, and have us make that connection, first of all, to really, because I think part of, as a country, our participation in the United Nations, even, I think because there's that distance, we don't always understand how the UN, to your point, relates to what we're doing. That's just so critical to start there. And the next part of that is looking at locally, how are we individually dealing with these.
So what might be an example? I mean, how could, say this is a focus on hunger and food, access to food. I mean, we hear the term in Chicago, the food deserts, where there's no grocery stores. So how can the kinds of things we're talking about here or the UN programs, how can that, or could that be applied locally to things like local food deserts?
Yeah, well, a couple of things, and I actually wanted to circle back to what you were saying about climate change, because I think another...
It's not happening, by the way. Just it's
okay.
to myth. Right.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, everything will be just fine.
So another interesting aspect about the Sustainable Development Goals is kind of the overlap that we see between them. So you talked about how climate change is impacting this other Sustainable Development Goal, but it also works the other way. So actually how I started with the United Nations Association, I participated in their Model UN program, which pretty much allows everyday citizens like Liana and I to understand what does it look like to be part of a General Assembly and talk about these issues. And so that particular program talked about food policy, and I had the opportunity to research and see how the kind of agriculture that we do in the United States, kind of the monoculture, concentrating on one particular crop and on a large scale, what is that doing to the environment, and how is that actually contributing to the problem of climate change? And if we continue,
what is that doing to the environment?
It doesn't help.
Doesn't help. Yeah.
And actually, if that is a huge source of carbon emissions and contributing to the problem a lot more than someone might think if they weren't too familiar with it. So understanding how kind of localized solutions, how are we looking at maybe urban agriculture or in communities and taking those lessons and applying that in different places. I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, they're not doing the kinds of agricultural practices that we have. So in some ways, we can learn from them.
Yeah, so
right?
then how do we fix that? We bring the education and the knowledge that we've learned here, and there's multiple organizations that you can work with that you take that information and knowledge and pass it on to internationally. So that's, again, yeah, and I agree with Liana, is that we kind of start here, and then once we know how to properly educate internationally is how we take it and we expand with it.
So one of the things I thought about when you're talking about farming practices in Africa, a very hot political topic of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, which are seen alternately by many scientists as being the best thing since sliced bread because it can increase crop yields in countries exactly like the ones we're talking about.
It's a highly debatable topic.
Or the other side that says we won't have anything to do with frankenfoods, that these things are horrible and they're going to kill us in the long run. We just haven't figured out how yet. So how does that enter into the conversation about food and accessibility?
Well, you said something interesting. You said, how do we figure it? There's no proven health effects that they found yet.
Good or bad? Good
or bad. And I think that's the stance that science has taken, and that science is shown. There's no health effects that have been proven, good or bad. But translating that, yes, into the farming. You know, I was watching this documentary, and I completely forgot the name of the documentary. But
I thought that only happened to me at my age, but it's good to see that happens to you guys too.
I think it happens to all of us.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's farmers who. There was a family who were growing trees of papaya, and it got hit with a disease, and it was wiping out their whole papaya farm. She couldn't feed her family. She had maybe 5 kids under the age of 5, and she couldn't feed her family. There was no source or no good papaya for her to provide an income to even feed her family. So she couldn't feed from an income, and she couldn't feed from her own farm. And there was a point where the GMO technology helped her and her farm kind of come over this illness.
By creating a strain that was immune to whatever this bug
that was immune,
killing
right. So what did that cause? That caused less maintenance, more growth, healthy growth of her crops, an income, and the ability to feed her family. And we see that. And I understand the other side effect, or the other side of this argument too, is we want the natural. We want the way our ancestors have eaten it. But yeah, there are positive and there are negatives to the outlook. But according to science to date, there hasn't been anything that's been proven.
So that must be part of, coming back to education, if you're out talking to high school students or whomever, are these the kinds of topics that would come up? Or do you get questions like that, like what about GMOs? Or do you make any effort, since it does appear that the science supports it supports GMOs as something that is generally a positive, and that the fears seem to be unfounded. Is that something that you talk about, or is that a topic that comes up? Do you use that as part of your educational endeavors?
So this is actually a really new program. We haven't presented our first public event on this. This is something we're scaling up towards, but
so I can have input. I can make
yes,
suggestions,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
We can imagine that we'll get a plethora of those questions.
Yeah.
You probably will.
Yeah.
But even if you look at those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, each one has its own targets, and some of them, in some ways, are difficult to balance because one part of it is increasing the productivity of these agriculture activities, so that there is a greater quantity. There's more mass that people can consume. But at the other side, you do have targets around maintaining the biodiversity because of concerns that you alluded to, and because we do want to maintain this kind of agricultural heritage that we still have access to, and I think that those are very difficult to balance, but ultimately when you're trying to end hunger, those are the kinds of questions that come up, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned the other Millennium Goals, the new ones, and there are 17 now instead of 15? There were 15 before, or is that just it ended in 2015?
Yes, it was ending in 2015. Yeah.
So now there are 17 goals.
Yeah.
So I know, Liana, that your focus is on food and hunger, but
yes.
Is UNA also focusing on all of these goals, all 17?
So we have one of our committees, so that's actually a way for people to get involved, is participating through different committees. We were looking actually at the different global conflicts that are happening and also looking at how those dynamics show up in our own society.
Which you told me became kind of a conflict in its own right?
Oh yeah. It's a challenge just by the nature of the United Nations, is being able to balance and remain neutral in some ways to make sure that all countries and their interests are represented.
And I didn't mean to segue to that just now, but since we
have.
So yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about the difficulty of this balance and how important it is to stay neutral, but at the same time there are cases where the science or the facts support one argument much more strongly than the other. And that's a conflict in and of itself, because politics doesn't always follow scientific fact, you know, and there may be legitimate political reasons, or there may just be non-legitimate political reasons, but they're nonetheless real because, even though they're just political. So how do you balance that? How do you navigate those tricky waters?
It's a struggle for sure. I think that the United Nations, of course, has its positions and values that it's come up with, and another, of course, kind of just innate challenge to the UN is that these are, for the most part, non-binding. There's not something that's some kind of external force that's requiring nations to abide by any of these things. But as an international community, we're trying to come together and stand by these kind of common values. And so if a country has violated any of these shared values, that at that point the UN does take positions and
isn't that in
points to
itself
that.
a source of disagreement and conflict? What are the shared values?
Absolutely.
I mean, I would think it's very,
Absolutely.
with all the countries in the world coming together, to decide on what those values actually are,
Yeah.
right,
Is in of itself is a conflict.
And,
is a conflict.
yeah, it's
It
a
needs conflict resolution.
I
Yeah.
think one of a very interesting debate I've heard also is when you talk about like human rights. What does that mean? There's not anything that points to we should have these 10 specific human rights just by nature of us being human beings that we are entitled to. That is its own debate. Is there are hundreds of rights that we should secure for the human population, or is there just a couple? And that's something I think we're all trying to figure out. And I think that again points to, should we be addressing some of these things on a global level, or taking them and looking at our local priorities as well and trying to figure out the best combination of those things.
There's a saying that I'm sure you're familiar with: all politics are local. When you get down to it. But I think the real value in that is that if you can't get it right locally, it's hard to tell someone else overseas, oh gee, here's how it ought to work. So that brings me back to the local efforts as well. Coming back to local,
Yeah.
what do you think needs fixing here that you guys look at?
I would say, just thinking about the goal that we're working on, here locally, probably access to food is a big one.
Similar, even though
Yeah.
it's not a matter of farming, it's logistics.
It is logistics. It's about the financial part of it. It's about the transportation. It's the little things that people don't really think about that prevent the access to the food. I mean, we have, what is it now, 82,000 homeless
Yes.
people.
Just in the
Just
city of Chicago,
just
right.
in the city of Chicago, not even extended. And how do we provide that access to them when they have very limited resources, I think is the biggest issue. And I think that's also where sustainable farming and urban agriculture comes in too, because it's about community gardening is a big thing that's been happening most recently, is trying to increase that access for people who can't get there.
And I would think that in particular in neighborhoods, even if we're not talking about homelessness, but in neighborhoods where the food deserts, where
Yeah.
there just are grocery stores there,
Yeah.
if people are in a position where they can grow their own food,
Absolutely.
even in an apartment building backyard, which might in fact be big enough to grow some vegetables,
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that can have a small scale effect that can be multiplied.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Just take, for example, tomatoes. I mean, that grows a plethora of, I mean, it grows in season so much that you can probably just keep
I'm
with
well
your
aware of
family.
that problem,
Yeah.
having grown tomatoes. The problem is not growing them. It's what you do with them
Yes.
once you have bushels of them in your kitchen.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
How do you get rid of them? How do you make them into something
Yeah.
that's useful? Right?
yeah. But it's a small ingredient like that. I mean, if we can, that's obviously we need more nutrients than that to survive and to live and to have access to. But yeah, absolutely taking advantage of the space that you have, whether it's in your home or backyard or the community garden. Maybe reach out and see if there's a community garden nearby.
Coming coming back to the goals generally, the 17 new goals, what do you think are the most important ones? Other than, I mean, I think food, if you can't eat, nothing else matters. I grant that. But putting that one aside, what do you think are some of the most important of the new goals?
That's a difficult one. And
well, that's why we're on the show.
I
I'm going to throw you a softball question.
Yeah, and I
Stimulate
feel
the
like
thought.
I'm going to be unfair and not give you a clear answer.
You won't be the first one on the show to do that.
Again, what I find the most fascinating, because we've been looking at nutrition, we've also been looking at the third one, which is promoting health and well-being for everyone at all ages, is just looking at the massive overlap that happens between the goals. And I don't think you can really isolate one without touching on all the others. You know, take gender equality as another really big one, and that's a conversation, of course, that's been happening in the U.S. It's been a prominent discussion that, again, that just points to one of those things that is not something that's happening over there. We're very much feeling it
here locally.
As a society, as individuals, we confront it every day. And so just that one goal, you know, if you empower more women, you know, the impact that they've shown economically on so many different levels, that just by making an impact in that one, you kind of automatically are able to create change across all the other ones. And so for me, I think that's the most fascinating part of looking at these
talking
goals.
about tie that to education, there's a saying in development circles that if you educate a man, you can educate him to do a job. If you educate a woman, you educate the family, because she will in turn educate the rest of the family from what she's learned. So there's a case where gender equality and education cross paths, right? So what are some of the other ones where we see this kind of, the word I'm looking for escapes me completely, but with this convergence of efforts? There were 17 of them. Surely there are.
Yeah, no, I think it's just across the board. Health and well-being, that's actually a space that outside of my volunteering with the United Nations, it's something I've looked at quite a bit. And we talk about health and we maybe think of our physical health a lot. That's typically what comes to mind. But well-being encompasses so many other different things. So well-being can talk about, you know, financial well-being is actually a topic that's come up quite a lot.
Financial security.
Financial security, how does that impact? That does have implications for someone's physical health, the stress it causes, the capacity to access food. But one of the other goals is having access to decent work. And again, you see that overlap, the financial well-being. And I think even one of the big surveys, Gallup, they talked about what is the one thing that everyone across the board, regardless of their culture, their country, what do they want? And it's just having a good job.
Well, and that brings us back to the question of homelessness. And I know we were talking about a previous show that we had done, and the fight for 15 in order to give people a living wage, so people who work don't end up homeless, which is something that actually happens, right?
Yeah.
So we only have about a minute left. A little less, because I haven't stopped talking. So what is the message that you'd like our viewers to know most about UNA? What should they take away from this show tonight?
I think involvement is the best way to become knowledgeable, to be immersed in the issues, in the international issues and local issues, is to become involved and volunteer. And if they're interested in volunteering, they can go to unachicago.org and become a member. I know we're both members and volunteers as well. But also, I think the one thing too, in relation to the goals that we're focusing on is, you know, the next time somebody or an audience member sits down and for their meal, just be present and kind of imagine where this tomato came from.
Or if it weren't here,
if
you
it weren't
have this feast laid out in front of you.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we're out of time, so we have to wrap up. Liana,
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.